it's Mr. Sorensen, and today we are going to take a look at this machine that you see here in front of you called the thickness planer. The thickness planer is a really great tool to have in a shop. If you want to work with boards other than the thickness that they come at Home Depot, you've got to have a thickness planer. Imagine trying to take this board, which is 3/4 of an inch thick, and taking it down to a 1/2 inch thick. That entire board, imagine trying to do that with some sort of hand tool. Probably not going to happen in this day and age. So the thickness planer allows me to do that. This thickness planer is 24 inches wide. I'm going to set the board in there like that, and it's going to take the entire surface off that board through its entire length in about that long. So this is a great tool to have. Not every shop has one, but it's a great tool to have, and today we're going to look at some of the ins and outs, the parts, the pieces, and then how you use it and the safety that will go along in keeping you safe as you use the thickness planer. Alright, so here I am at the front of the thickness planer, and there's a handful of things that we can see here. One of the nice things about a thickness planer is that all the moving parts are encased down inside this housing. So it's not very easy to get your hands into moving parts. However, the thickness planer does have a really large motor. So one potential problem with a thickness planer is that if your baggy clothing were to get caught on a piece of wood, it could pull you in. And this is probably a 5 or 6 horsepower motor. 6 horses are not going to know that you're tugging on the board trying to keep it from going in. So probably one of the biggest safety issues on a thickness planer is just keeping baggy clothes from getting caught up in a piece of wood and getting pulled in. So we'll look at the parts and pieces that are housed inside in a minute. This is really the control panel and where I work from. So we have a cast iron in-feed table, and then on the other side you would have the cast iron out-feed table, and this is where I'm going to set my board in. Now a thickness planer is unique in that it has in-feed rollers and out-feed rollers. There's only 2 machines in the shop where the machine itself does all the work. In most cases, you're the operator responsible to push the board through. You're responsible to push it at the correct speed. But in the case of a planer, the operator doesn't do any of that. That's all preset. I'm going to just stick the board on the in-feed table. I'm going to push it in the opening right there. The in-feed rollers will pick it up, and the machine is going to take the board and pull it through at its own speed. All I'm going to do is go around to the other side and grasp it when it comes out. So this is the cast iron in-feed table. Over here we have a couple other items. So I have the on and off switch right here, which also doubles, the off switch also doubles as a brake. If I ever get into trouble, there's a big ball handle right here that I just want to push on really hard, and it'll start to bring the machine to a stop. Now a more important button over here is the in-feed roller and the out-feed roller on and off switch. If I were to get in trouble and my clothing were to be caught on a board, I really don't care if the motor is spinning. What I want to do is stop the forward motion of the board into the machine. That can be stopped very fast by pushing the in-feed roller off button. That's going to bring the forward motion of the board to a stop pretty quickly. Pushing on the brake is going to take a long time to get this big giant motor and all the steel that is in there to slow down. So in the case of a safety emergency, I always want to remember, turn off the in-feed roller first. Get the in-feed roller turned off. Then worry about the motor later. So all of the on and off switches are right here in this little section. So also over here is the table raising and lowering hand wheel. The table raising and lowering hand wheel. And it's a giant wheel over here that has to be turned, and as I turn it, it's either going to lower the in-feed and out-feed table or raise it. So that handle is over here at the control center as well. Another item that's over here is the feed rate shift handle. So I can actually before I ever work with the machine, I can adjust the speed. Do I want the board to go through at a faster rate or at a slower rate? And so that adjustment handle is also over here by the control panel where the on and off switch are. I'm going to take a second and bring you in close so you can see these items. So what you're seeing here in front of you is the on and off switch right in here. Down here below we have the feed rate on and off switch. Right here is the table raising and lowering hand wheel, where I'm going to turn that to lower or raise the table. If I look down a little lower, right there, this right here is the feed rate shift handle, and that can be adjusted before using the planer to figure out what speed do I want the board to go through the machine. So another important element that you see right here at the front of the table by the on and off switch is the depth of cut scale. The depth of cut scale, and so that's basically a ruler. Right here connected to the table is an arrow, and so as I turn the hand wheel, the arrow is going to either move up and down on the ruler or the scale, and that's going to allow me to adjust correctly the amount of material I want to take off my board. Alright, well, as I told you, the planer pulls the board through on its own. So what I want to show you right now is right down in this opening, right inside the housing. Because if I look in there, I can see the feed rollers that are going to pull this board through the machine. Alright, right here you can see the feed rollers. If you look there inside the opening of the machine, I'm looking down inside the housing now. You see that little serrated edge that you see there, those little serrated rollers. Those are the feed rollers, and those are what grip on your board and pull your board through the machine by themselves. Right? Remember, on a planer, the operator is not pushing the board through the machine. Those feed rollers housed down inside the machine are pulling the board through by themselves. Now also up here on the top of this planer is the pressure bar, and this is what's going to put pressure down on the piece of wood. It's going to hold it against the table. It's going to help pull this piece through on its own. And there are these are weights you see right here. These are all weights, and they are on a spring-loaded lever, which is right here. You see the lever right here. So this is a pressure bar adjusting bolts that would allow us to adjust that pressure so that the piece of wood will go through accurately, efficiently, without things like snipe or cutout. Now let's see if we can take a look inside the machine and see a few of the items that are inside getting the work done. Well, now we're looking inside of the machine, inside the covered housing that keeps you out of all the moving parts. And up in here, pretty interesting to see what's in here. I can see the feed rollers, which are lots of little teeth around a cylinder that's going to grab that board and pull it through. And there's an in-feed roller, and over here I see an out-feed roller. Also inside the housing up in here is something called a chip breaker. A chip breaker is a piece of metal that's going to rest on the board as the board comes through and as the cutting takes place, and it's going to really help keep pieces of the board from chipping off as the blade hits it. So there's a chip breaker in there. There's also some rollers in there that keep pressure down on the board. They keep the board pressed down to the surface of the table so that it will run smoothly through. The other thing I see right down the center of the covered area is a giant cylinder that has 2 or 3 high-speed steel blades attached. That's the cutter head, and the cutter head is going to do all this work. Notice it can cut a board 24 inches wide all the way across. It's got to do an enormous amount of work. That's why you can only take off a 1/16 of an inch per cut. That runs right here down the center of this covered area. All right, well, what you see over my shoulder here in the bottom of the machine are the table rollers, and that little piece right there is going to, right here is a roller. That's going to help the board scoot through the machine as it gets fed in there and pulled through. Table roller. Well, last but not least is this big device coming up out of the top. That's the dust collection port, and that's critical on a planer. The planer makes an enormous amount of wood chips as it cuts, and if you don't have a dust collection port that's able to suck all that the chips of wood out, the chips of wood get left in there, and the feed rollers and the rollers in there smash those chips down onto your board, and it makes a mess of the surface of the board. So every planer really needs a dust collector and a way to get the chips out so that you end up with a really nice, smooth, clean final product. Well, let's take a couple minutes to look at some of the safety and the way we're going to use this so that we don't get hurt. First of all, a planer is very loud. So in most cases, when I use a planer, I want to make sure I'm wearing ear protection. It's one of the loudest tools in the shop. I always want to keep my fingers away from the infeed table. A planer is notorious for when you stick the board in the planer and it hits the feed roller, especially on shorter boards, the boards want to lift up off the table, and then as the feed roller rolls onto the board, it's going to slam it down to the tabletop. And if your fingers are underneath that, you're going to get a pretty nicely pinched finger. So I always want to keep my fingers away from the tabletop as I'm starting to feed the board in. I never want to look into the machine to see what's going on. If something is wrong and it's not running correctly and the board gets stuck and doesn't feed forward, then I want to just turn the machine off, bring it to a stop, lower the table, pull the board out, and figure out what's wrong. But don't look into an operating machine, either in the in-feed side or the out-feed side. It could pick that moment to break a board apart, break a knot apart, and shoot all of that stuff out of the machine. And what you've done is put your face down there in front of it to get hit by all those parts. So I typically, when I use a machine safely, I'm going to stand to the side of the machine, don't stand in front of the opening, and I'm going to generally stand right here on the side that has all the controls so I can quickly turn the machine off if I need to. I want to check my board before I put it in. I want to check to make sure that there are no knots, loose knots. This board has a knot right here, and that is not what it's talking about, right? I'm looking for loose knots, knots that are potentially going to fall out of the board. This one doesn't have that problem, and so I'm okay to send this board through. I also want to look for nails and screws and nuts and bolts and things like that. I shouldn't be putting anything metal through the planer. Also, dried glue will chip a planer blade. So I always want to look, if this is laminated, if I've glued several pieces of wood together, I never want to put that directly into the planer. I always want to use a glue scraper and scrape as much of that glue off as I can before I put that board into the planer. Now, the stock has to be longer than the distance between the feed rollers. Remember, on this machine, the machine itself, the feed rollers are going to pull the board through. If the board is not longer than the distance between the two feed rollers, the board's going to get stuck in there. So I always want to make sure that the board is about 12 inches or longer, 13 inches or longer. The board has to be longer than the distance between the two feed rollers. Lastly, I want to make sure that I only cut off 1/16 of an inch or less of material. So I have to know what the thickness is now before I put it in so that I can correctly set the depth of cut. The depth of cut should be no more than 1/16 off of this board. And then I'm going to set it in here. I'm going to let it go for a little bit. Then I'll walk around from the other side. Again, I don't want to stand in front of the opening. I'll just wait there until the board comes completely out, and then I'm going to pull it out. I don't want to grip it. I don't want to put my hands close to the table. I just want to wait until it gets all the way through before I lift it up, bring it back around for its next cut. So this piece of wood right here is about 15/16 of an inch thick. So the first thing I do here is I'm going to use my hand wheel to set the arrow at the scale. So that's going to be about 7/8 of an inch, 14/16. The next thing I'm going to do is make sure I have my feed roller switch on. I make sure I put my ear protection on because it's going to be pretty loud. Now I'm ready to turn the machine on and set the board in. And again, I'm just going to set it in. I keep my hands back from the table so that they don't get pinched. Well, in 2 or 3 passes of this board, I've taken an enormous amount of wood off the surface, and I've gotten my piece down to about 12 or 11/16 of an inch thick. Imagine trying to do that on about a 7-foot board if you didn't have the thickness planer. Trying to do this by hand, like my grandfather used to do, would take an enormous amount of labor. So the planer is a great tool to have around, speeds up our job considerably as long as we use it safely. All right, well, you've gotten to see the planer work. You've gotten to see some of the parts of the planer and how it's put together, what makes it work. We've looked at some safety that we want to think about. Great machine to have in a shop, can be very dangerous. I think you saw there too in that slow motion view how that board lifted up as it went into the feed roller and then slammed back down. Boy, if your fingers were underneath that, those fingers are going to be pinched really, 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 really heavily. And you're going to probably need to go to the hospital. So while the planer is a great machine to work and it's generally pretty safe because all the moving parts are encased inside, we still want to give it respect. We want to use it wisely so that we end up with great finished products without any injury in the process. So I hope you've enjoyed getting a chance to look at this great machine that we have, that we get to work with, and I look forward to seeing you next time when we take a look at another machine in the shop here at Royal.